Now, the United Nations Secretary General says that we're seeing a Russian military operation inside the sovereign territory of Ukraine on a scale that Europe has not seen in decades. Antonio Guterres announced that the United Nations would allocate $20 million from its Central Emergency Response Fund to meet immediate humanitarian needs in the region, as he warns that the decisions of the coming days would shape the world and directly affect the lives of millions of people. He was speaking moments before U.S. President Joe Biden, who announced additional sanctions against the Russian Federation.
Day after day, I've been clear that such unilateral measures conflict directly with the United Nations Charter. The Charter is clear, and I quote, "All members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. The use of force by one country against another is the repudiation of the principles that every country has committed to uphold. And this applies to the present military offensive. It is wrong, it is against the Charter, it is unacceptable, but it is not irreversible. I repeat my appeal from last night to President Putin. Stop the military operation. Bring the troops back to Russia. We know the toll of war.
Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences. Today, I'm authorizing additional strong sanctions and new limitations on what can be exported to Russia. This is going to impose severe cost on the Russian economy, both immediately and over time. We have purposefully designed these sanctions to maximize the long-term impact on Russia and to minimize the impact on the United States and our allies. And I want to be clear, the United States is not doing this alone. For months, we've been building a coalition of partners representing well more than half the global economy. 27 members of the European Union, including France, Germany, Italy, as well as the United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and many others, to amplify the joint impact of our response.
All right, that's President Joe Biden there, speaking very tough language there. Much like a number of leaders that are allies, particularly the G7 countries, and it looks as if they're coming together to have a common and determined response against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We're hearing language from President Emmanuel Macron in France, talking about a severe response without weakness and with cold blood against Russia, and the Germans as well. So we're understanding that the EU is gathering to discuss the next measures that they can take. But it's all this evening, particularly with our broadcasts. We began with President Joe Biden and his response as he was speaking to the media. And SABC Correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease joins us now to tell us a little bit about what's been playing out in New York, from New York, in the United States. Sherwin, thanks very much indeed for joining us. President Biden speaking quite tough earlier today.
Yeah, and it's one of those scenarios, Peter, that you're either with us or you're against us, right? Telling the world basically to pick a side here in terms of their coalescence around a series of packages along with Western nations, European nations, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, in addition to that, in really trying to implement a series of package economic sanctions, punitive measures here, in the absence, of course, of military action. You'll recall that Ukraine is not a member of NATO yet. maybe never will be, could be in the future. But essentially that Article 5 of the rules that govern NATO does not apply here. But President Biden also, in announcing those sanctions at the White House earlier today, talking about how they are fortifying their positions in Eastern Europe, in those Baltic states, the likes of Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, that essentially border where this aggression is playing itself out right now. So very firm that they will defend NATO territory, but of course that does not apply to Ukraine in this instance. And so we are left with these series of economic punitive measures that have been announced. A first tranche earlier this week, a second tranche now that Russian boots are on the ground in Ukraine. And some of this, let me just give you a sense of what this includes. It limits Russia's ability, Peter, to do business with the dollar, euro, pound and the yen. It is blocking technology exports to Russia. It sanctions 4 additional banks. There was one bank sanctioned earlier this week. Now the top 5 banks in Russia will be sanctioned, including a freezing of their assets in the United States. It restricts travel and implements asset freezes on Russia's elite billionaires. The oligarchs in Russia is a word you often hear. And that, of course, comes in addition to earlier sanctions, sanctioning Russia's sovereign debt that prohibits it now from fundraising on European and Western markets. And, of course, there are also sanctions being applied to the owners of the Nord Stream's 2 gas pipeline, essentially a Russian-owned pipeline that links Russia with Germany and the rest of Europe in terms of those gas production. So we are left with the economic consequences. There was a question also put to Biden by the press corps at the White House as to why he is not directly sanctioning Vladimir Putin. But as the president has long argued, they are doing a series of sanctions, different iterations of sanctions, and hoping to maintain a window of diplomacy open here in case there might be a pullback from Putin.
All right, so I think you've started to give us a sense of the full spectrum of sanctions against Russia and where they stand at this stage. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about that and what Biden said with this regard.
Yeah, we have a clip from President really talking about, the consequence management is what we use when we talk about consequences within a company, but really in the geopolitical space, really labeling Putin here as the aggressor and the global pariah. This is what Biden said earlier.
Putin's aggression against Ukraine will end up costing Russia dearly, economically and strategically. We will make sure of that. Putin will be a pariah on the international stage. Any nation that countenances Russia's naked aggression against Ukraine will be stained by association. When the history of this era is written, Putin's choice to make a totally unjustifiable war on Ukraine will have left Russia weaker and the rest of the world stronger. Liberty, democracy, human dignity, these are the forces far more powerful than fear and oppression. They cannot be extinguished by tyrants like Putin and his armies. They cannot be erased from people's hearts and hopes by any amount of violence and intimidation. They endure. In the contest between democracy and autocracy, between sovereignty and subjugation, make no mistake, freedom will prevail.
And Peter, President Biden has now long talked about this competition really on the global stage between democracies and autocracies. And one of the questions he received after announcing the additional sanctions was whether his team was talking to China and getting them on board in terms of this effort to further isolate Russia on the global stage. And the president responded that he could not comment on that at this stage. But one imagines that there are some backroom maneuverings happening right now.
Yeah, so we have Western sanctions on the one hand, and then we have an ongoing diplomatic track on the other that seeks to pressure Russia in the United Nations Security Council. What are you learning is happening at this hour?
Yeah, worth remembering that the UN Security Council has met in emergency sessions on Monday and on Wednesday, starting at around 9:30 p.m., going quite late here in the evening at the request of Ukraine. And what the U.S. Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield announced in that session last night is that she would be putting on the table a draft resolution. And what that draft resolution, I have it in front of me, Peter, it basically decides that the Russian Federation shall immediately, completely and unconditionally withdraw its military forces from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. It affirms the sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine, condemns Russia's actions in the strongest terms, and that Russia should cease to use force against Ukraine and other UN member states, right? But the kicker, of course, is that Russia is a permanent member of this council, so this is a resolution that, when put to a vote tomorrow, will be blocked, right? And then they will move this process to the General Assembly, and really what they are seeking to achieve here, certainly according to senior U.S. administration officials, is that despite Russia having a veto, the Security Council cannot turn a blind eye to what is happening in Ukraine. They talked about how we expect Russia to veto, but it will underscore their isolation. It's important to send a message that the Security Council will not look away. It's a critical venue, the Security Council, that is, Peter, where Russia must explain itself. And I think that certainly remains true. Despite the criticism that is leveled against this council as being ineffective, Russia will have to explain itself. And it said it would be cynical if the council failed to consider a resolution. So more political theatre certainly expected. This resolution will be blocked. But the goal, I think, certainly from the United States and its allies and partners, is to show in a public way the isolation of Russia. There is an expectation that China is sort of treading a very fine line here because, you know, they tend to be very close to Russia, particularly in the Security Council scenario. So it's going to be very interesting to see if China will abstain, further isolating Russia if it were to employ the veto. We also understand from European diplomats that if that resolution fails as expected, they will then go to the General Assembly. They will put a resolution to a vote in the General Assembly, really to give a global perspective among the 193 member states as to where they fall in terms of their support for both for either side here. And the expectation is a GA resolution would pass, but again, a GA resolution, of course, is not legally binding. So in essence, it will show kind of the moral perspective of the world, but doesn't actually, might not demand changes on the ground. This is what President Biden also said in terms of political and economic consequences. Watch.
This aggression cannot go unanswered. If it did, the consequences for America would be much worse. America stands up to bullies. We stand up for freedom. This is who we are. Let me also repeat the warning I made last week. If Russia pursues cyber attacks against our companies, our critical infrastructure, we are prepared to respond. For months, we've been working closely with the private sector to harden our cyber defenses, sharpen our ability to respond to Russian cyber attacks as well. I spoke last night to President Zelensky of Ukraine, and I assured him that the United States, together with our allies and partners in Europe, will support the Ukrainian people as they defend their country.
Peter, I also heard you speaking earlier about how quiet the streets of Kiev looked in that live shot that we have. I spoke earlier to South Africa's ambassador to Kiev, Andrei Groenewald, and he talked about the fact that they went into the office still today, that the capital was empty. This is a city of about 3 million people, one of the seventh most busy, populated, the seventh largest in terms of population in Europe. And he said it was, he's never seen a city with so many people, so quiet. He said a lot of people were leaving the capital to go to the rural areas. Of course, rural areas would be less likely to be targeted by Russian missiles. He said he'd woken up to explosions in Kiev earlier this morning, and that there was a somber atmosphere in the city, and one can understand that.
All right, Sherwin, talk a little bit about the atmosphere in the room during those council meetings. Obviously, there are rules that govern these processes, but speak to the tensions that sometimes bubble over between diplomats representing very different positions.
Yeah, this was a high-stakes meeting last night, right? The Secretary General was asked to brief. Ukraine requested this emergency session after they had, after the separatist republics had requested Russia's military intervention, and of course then President Putin signing those decrees, and of course Russian boots were then en route to the Donbas region and the republics of Luhansk and Donetsk. The Secretary General walked in, and there was this tension in the room, Peter, where he was in a very animated discussion. Of course, we didn't have the audio, but we had the visual of him in an animated discussion with the Russian ambassador, Vasily Nebenzia. Vasily Nebenzia, at the current moment, is president of the UN Security Council. It's a rotational seat, and Russia is president for the month of February. The Secretary General and him have disagreed about who is right and wrong here. The SGS talked a lot about the violations of the UN Charter, the violations of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and appealed at the beginning of that meeting for Russian troops not to go in. And of course, we don't know what was the essence of that discussion, but of course, during that meeting, Peter, Russian missiles started flying over Kiev, and during a meeting that was really seeking to get a pullback from President Putin, the Secretary General, rather deflated, emerged from that meeting saying he has to now change his request to Putin, that he mustn't, the request is no longer that he shouldn't go in, it's that he now pulls his troops out of Ukraine. There was also a very animated moment between the Ukrainian ambassador and the Russian ambassador, where he literally told Vasily Nebenzia to call Lavrov on the phone. We have this video. Let's take a look at how that played out. Watch.
So now I would like to ask the ambassador of the Russian Federation to say on the record that at this very moment your troops do not shell and bomb Ukrainian cities, that your troops do not move in the territory of Ukraine. You have a smartphone, you can call Lavrov right now. We can make a pause to let you go out and call him. Well, as I said, relinquish your duties as a chair. Call Putin, call Lavrov to stop aggression. And I welcome the decision of some members of this council to meet as soon as possible to consider the necessary decision that would condemn the aggression that you launch on my people. There is no purgatory for war criminals. They go straight to hell, Ambassador.
Worth repeating there, Peter, the Ukrainian ambassador speaking directly to his Russian counterpart, quote, "There is no purgatory for war criminals. They go straight to hell." Ambassador, what a moment in the council, certainly from us observing that process play out live. Peter?
All right, Sherwin, perhaps finally, what sort of reaction has been coming from further afield, maybe Africa and other places, about what's happening?
It's a great question. Remember, we have 3 African countries in the UN Security Council, Ghana, Gabon and Kenya, and they have taken a very firm position in solidarity with Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty, and asked for Russia to withdraw its troops as well. The Kenyan ambassador, Martin Kimani, has been quite vocal about this in terms of using Africa's example, right? Colonialism and what that meant for the distribution of African states and borders that were not determined by Africans themselves, and how they're not fighting about those borders anymore, but really about the future of their citizens. And this was a message he was trying to relay to the Russian president, that you cannot, base your position today on the USSR of old and using Africa very much in terms of the colonial context to get that point across. We also got a very powerful statement from the South African government earlier today, Peter. They called for negotiations to continue using the South African political settlement of the early 1990s. They called for Russian troops to withdraw, for President Putin to withdraw those troops from Russia. So very strong positions here about territorial integrity and the respect for the UN Charter from the African states, and that was refreshing to see.
Sherwin, that's where we'll leave it for the time being as this story unfolds. I'm sure you're not going to get a lot of sleep, and we look forward to chatting to you probably on Morning Live. That's Sherwin Bryce-Pease speaking to us from New York there. All right, we're going to take a quick